reason for that is the language that they're using. Just transition is the language that they used when they phased out the coal industry. It is a social justice term. If they wanted to talk about sustainable jobs, that's completely different. And we'd be quite happy to talk to them about sustainable jobs in carbon tech, sustainable jobs in hydrogen, sustainable jobs in this new economy that we're developing around small modular nuclear and other types of projects. I think we're all on board with that. But to use that terminology, they're virtue signaling to an extreme base that is openly advocating to shut down oil and natural gas. Because look at what happened at a COP27. The final communique talked about ultimately shutting down the oil and natural gas industry in the same way that coal had been phased out. We have a prime minister who, when he ran in the last election, talked about that the need to phase out oil sands eventually. He looked at it as inevitability. We don't look at it that way at all. We think that the world is going to need more natural gas. We believe that with carbon capture technology, it's going to make it more and more sustainable. Hydrogen at its base, the best way to make it is out of methane, which is natural gas. When you look at our oil sands producers, they have an aggressive strategy to reduce emissions and use more bitumen beyond combustion. There's a petrochemical industry that we've been supporting here. So we're just shifting the paradigm. This is not about phasing out any of these jobs. It's about growing them and expanding the opportunity for oil and natural gas workers. And that's the kind of language I would like to hear the Prime Minister use, because we I think, missed an opportunity when the German Chancellor was here, saying that there wasn't a business case for LNG. The Japanese Prime Minister is coming this week begging us to do more development so that we can export LNG. And I would like, for a change, for the Prime Minister to say, yes, we can, and to work with us on making that happen. And this kind of targeted attack on our industry, it doesn't lend itself to cooperative federalism. That's what I'm worried about, and I do take him seriously because of the past statements that he's made on this.
Now, as a supplementary, let us just say for the moment that your fears are in large part realized, and he does proceed aggressively, because we don't know what the Just Transition Plan is yet. But let's say it is a very aggressive plan. What is it that, and a lot of, I think, Albertans would like to know, what is it that you are willing to do? Like when you say, we're just not going to allow him to do this. Does this mean, you know, readers have asked me this morning, does that mean the Sovereignty Act? Does that mean, like, what does that exactly mean? It's one thing to say that you don't like what Trudeau's doing. It's also the right, you also say you'll stand up. But what happens if he actually does pursue an aggressive agenda? What are you concretely prepared to do in response?
Again, I have to see what it is that he has planned, but I'll give you a for instance. This announcement that somehow within 2 years we're going to have 20% of all new vehicles in Alberta be electric vehicles. So I mean, I'm wondering why he isn't asked how are we going to do that. I know, for instance, because I drove a hybrid car over the summer, there's a 5-year waiting list for hybrid vehicles with Toyota, and an equally long waiting list for other electric vehicles. How do you then mandate that 20% of all vehicles sold in Alberta are going to be electric when they aren't even going to be available? I just spoke yesterday with a developer who's installing, who needs to install transformers. We used to be able to get them within days. There's an 80-week delay to install a transformer. You need to do that to be able to enable more houses to be able to have plug-in vehicles. We've got a 2-year wait to be able to even upgrade our power grid. So at some point we have to have an honest conversation about what's doable and what's possible, because here is the issue. If the federal government is pursuing emissions caps and targets that are too aggressive and too short a time frame and unachievable, it is a de facto production cap, which means it's a violation of our constitutional right to choose to develop our own resources. So those are the conversations we're having publicly right now, making them aware that the things that they're announcing are not achievable in the time frame they want to announce it. But if we're working towards the same goal of emissions reduction, and we have a reasonable time frame, and we're working towards having the same kind of technological advancement, then I think we can work collaboratively and cooperatively. So I'm going to try to do that approach first. My read of how the Supreme Court operates is that if we both agree that there's a problem, Alberta does not act in its area of jurisdiction, then the courts will defer to Ottawa to act in our areas of jurisdiction. It's why we have a carbon tax, and it's why they took over plastics. So we are going to make sure that we put forward a robust plan to reduce emissions in a way that works for Alberta. And then we'll be prepared to, if we have to have them take us to court to fight it out, because we are not phasing this industry out. We don't have to. We can export LNG, which will reduce global emissions. We can use carbon technology to capture CO2, embed it into useful products or bury it underground. We can develop a hydrogen industry. We can develop a small modular nuclear industry. And those are all of the things that get us to the same goal. So I believe that if it came down to a court fight, that we'd win it.
Let me correct you there for a second. It's by 2026, in 3 years, there's 20% zero emissions vehicle mandate, not 2 years.
Okay, I thought he said 2025.
But I wanted to finish your thought there. How, because your office had talked about using the Sovereignty Act to blunt the effect or somehow combat the zero emissions vehicle. How would that work?
I think what I'm interested in looking at is how might we be able to bring more zero emissions vehicles on in our market. Our market, it actually makes more sense for us to be pursuing hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. And I quite frankly don't think that the federal government is doing enough to be able to attract that kind of development here. So that's the kind of thing I'd like to see, is are we able to attract Toyota or Honda or Hyundai to come here and develop hydrogen fuel cell vehicles? Are we able to do more work with our transportation industry to do dual use engines as they are right now and converting them to hydrogen and biodiesel? Is there some way that we can use additives or new products to be able to reduce overall emissions? I've seen a number of technological advancements along those lines. So there are different ways to be able to achieve a reduced emissions outcome, and that's what we'll be putting on the table.
Sorry, once again, that doesn't explain how the Sovereignty Act would work. There's nothing.
As I said, we haven't made a decision to invoke the Sovereignty Act on anything.
I have a different topic for you. We have a statement from Health Canada that says they received proposals by Alberta for the importation of children's ibuprofen and acetaminophen for use in pharmacies, and that a decision was provided to you guys in December. What exactly did that decision say?
There's a couple of things that we had to do in working through with a new supplier. The Health Canada has to go through and examine the manufacturer. They have to examine our import facilities. We had to make sure that the formulation was the same as we would sell for generic products here. We had to get French and English packaging approved. And we went through all of those different steps, and so as a result, we have our first shipment arriving on the weekend. It's going to be for Alberta Health Services use. It's 250,000 bottles. The remaining 4.750 bottles is 4.750 million bottles are going to be subject to an additional delay, because for retail use you have to have a child-proof cap. As I understand it, we are working on making sure that that approval process is taking place, and so that'll be the second batch. And as soon as we know when the retail use is going to be available, we'll do another press release. But the good news is that our Alberta Health Services hospitals will have the first shipment by this weekend.
Well, I'm talking specifically about pharmacies. So those are supposed to be on the shelves by Christmas is what you guys said. They aren't on the shelves. So I'm just wondering, so how I understand it is that it was actually rejected, that proposal, in December, and then you had to put forward a new proposal. Is that correct?
No, it was just a process we went through. I mean, we respect Health Canada has a role in making sure that we have the safest product possible on the shelf. And the issue that they had was that when you make a product available for a retail use, it has to have a child-proof cap. So we're just working with the manufacturer to make sure that that is in place so that we can make it available for retail use. And look, I don't want to rush Health Canada. Certainly want to make sure that people, as soon as the supply arrives, that they feel confident in it. It really was just a matter of us meeting the regulatory conditions, and that was the last condition we needed to meet.
So you had to put forward a new application.
We've been working with them right from the beginning. We always knew that we would have a certain amount that would arrive that would be for AHS use, and then we had to continue working with them to make sure that we had the bottling that met their specifications. One of the specifications was we had to make sure that it was listed in the same familiar type of formulation that we have in Canada. We had to make sure French and English labeling, and this last hurdle is we just have to make sure we've got the child-proof cap. So it's been a process that we've been going on. It's just taken a little bit longer than we expected, but the first shipment is arriving this weekend for Alberta Health Services.
Just to confirm, this was the same application that came back in December.
I've been working with this on this all the way along. We have been working with Alberta Health, Health Canada, to make sure that we were meeting all of their compliance. It's a brand new supplier. There's just a couple of hurdles that we needed to get through, and we're almost on the last one.
Back on the Sovereignty Act in regards to your government, and respectfully, there's been a lot of complaints from your government towards the federal government in recent weeks. The last couple of days, Minister Chandro today is releasing a statement in regards to the firearms confiscation. Just yesterday, Mr. Lowen talking about Moraine Lake, even though that's a national park, so I don't know where the Sovereignty Act would come in there. We've heard the energy side of this as well. When does it become more about enacting this legislation, using it for what it's intended to do instead of just complaining to the federal government?
Well, it's one more tool as in us pushing back against Ottawa. I think we've got lots of tools at our disposal. I'm just disappointed with the federal government that they've said that they didn't want to fight, and yet they're continuing to make announcements without consulting with us. They came through with changes to the firearms legislation that wasn't supposed to include hunters and sports shooters until the last minute when it did. The issue around Moraine Lake, they didn't even call our parks minister. There's some things that they could have done on Moraine Lake, because I recognize that they've got limited parking, but how are people with canoes and kayaks and dogs supposed to get up there? The hours that they're proposing are too limited. There could have been more that they could have done to reduce the cost on this, because the parking is for free, and we want to make sure that that there's more accessibility. So those are the kind of things that if they had just reached out and talked to us, we might have been able to make some resolution. And certainly on the issue of emissions reduction, my environment minister, Sonia Savage, has gone to COP27. She's gone to COP15. She's engaging with the department. For them to just come out of the blue with this legislation without calling us, that to me is provocative. And we have demonstrated that we are putting up a shield so that they stop doing this. And that's what we had hoped, that they would take it in the spirit it's intended, which is don't pass legislation or announce legislation in our areas of jurisdiction. That's all we're asking for. So I hope that we can move towards something more collaborative so that we can achieve the same ends that we all want. But I'm not very impressed with the way this new year has started.
Would you agree that Moraine Lake is technically federal jurisdiction and a national park?
Yeah, but why can't they? I mean, why can't they have called us to just give us the heads up on things? That's what I don't understand, because we all know that making any decision that's going to impact access is going to have a reaction. People don't know the difference about who to call, federal or provincial government. It kind of hit us out of the blue as well. And we think that there's some reasonable changes that they can make that would make sure it was more accessible. So I think that was the frustration that my Forestry, Parks and Tourism Minister was expressing.
You talk about it being a symbolic gesture, putting a shield around Alberta. At what point does it stop becoming, it's implemented, we're signaling something, and when does it become action? If you aren't happy with how the new year started, if you aren't happy with a litany of things that you have discussed at length, when does it shift? What would that take?
It depends on how far the Prime Minister is prepared to go in pushing this. I know that there are ministers in his government that we can work with that understand our position, and we're working closely with them to try to make sure that we can achieve our common goals. So I'm just going to keep on working on in that vein until we see what kind of legislation comes forward. They're not back, I don't believe, until January the 30th. So I want to see what the legislation looks like and what kind of impact it's going to have. But they need to stop this language. They need to stop using the social justice language of just transition, because we all know what that means. It means phasing out oil and natural gas workers, and that is not on. If they want to talk to us about how we'll invest in hydrogen, how we can collaboratively invest in carbon capture and technology, I'm all open to having that discussion, as I told the Prime Minister the first time that I spoke with him. But I would just like to see that they're recognizing that we are a leader in this area. We're a leader on hydrogen production. We're a leader on carbon technology, as opposed to acting like somehow we're late to the party on this. We're not. We've been doing this kind of work for decades in hydrogen, and since 2007 on carbon technology. So I think that there's a little bit of politicking happening at the federal level. Maybe there's a federal election coming, but it's not helpful when we're trying to find some joint and common solutions around these issues.
You talked about being willing to move forward with healthcare measures, even if the federal government doesn't come to the table with more funding. But what does that look like? Where would that money come from if you're talking about big reforms to the system beyond what you've announced already?
Here's the thing. I look at healthcare as the number one most important thing Albertans expect me to act on and to make improvements on, which is why it was the first action that I took after getting elected, was to make sure that we put in a new official administrator who could help guide some of those changes. And we identified 4 areas that we needed to work on. One was reducing emergency wait times. Another was reducing the amount of wait that ambulances have at hospital. The third was reducing the surgical wait times. And the fourth one is making sure that everyone has a medical home, a family doctor or a group of doctors who can help them. And none of those things require me to sit back and wait for the federal government to come in and help. We have to act on those things regardless. And so we're making strides on that. We're already intending to put $600 million per year back into the system next year and the following year. And we're just going to keep on making those kind of incremental changes. I can't stop doing reform because the federal government doesn't want to partner with us. So great if he comes to the table with more funding support, but we're not going to stop with the reforms that we're doing.
How does that look then for Albertans if you're moving forward with some of these reforms without waiting for the federal government's funding there? How do you move forward with that, and what difference would that be with the federal government, without the federal government?
Well, a couple things. I mean, this is a reason why we announced non-ambulance transfers in December, because if you can have a separate vehicle that is able to transport a patient to a hospital or to a medical appointment, which is a routine appointment, then that ambulance stays available in the community when there's an acute need. I asked Dr. John if he could give me an assessment. How many operating rooms have we not opened? How many have been mothballed? And he said that there's 55. And he said that there's actually some really quick changes that you can make to bring them back on. So as I understand it, we fixed the HVAC system in the Camrose Hospital. It's coming on in the next couple of weeks. And we also reopened 2 operating rooms in our Northern Territory as well. So those are the kind of things that we're working on. When it comes to the medical practice and creating a medical home, we already negotiated, our Health Minister Jason Copping negotiated a new contract with the doctors that allow for alternative payments so that you can have a doctor and a nurse practitioner and a physiotherapist and a chiropractor all within the umbrella of one practice. And they agreed that we would work towards having 25% of doctors on that by the time of the next contract renewal. So those are things that we can do that are structural changes that don't necessarily end up costing more money. Because if you can build out your primary care system so that somebody has a family doctor to go to, then they don't end up in an emergency room. If you can empower your paramedics so that they can do more treatment on site, then they don't end up in the emergency room. If you can have nurses triage a different way so that they can treat patients and release them faster, that doesn't necessarily cost more money. It's just a structural change. So those are the kind of changes that we're working at. It's incremental decisions, dozens of different decisions every day across the entire system that's going to make a big difference.
So is there something that will be done in lieu if that increase does not happen? Like, where are we at in that situation right now in terms of negotiations with the federal government? And what could that mean for Albertans who are seeking health care? Like, for individual people, does that mean money out of their pocket at some point, or where are we looking?
There's a couple of things that we're looking at doing. So first of all, Dr. John Cowell's been working very closely with Alberta Health Services Management to identify the measures on those 4 key things that I was talking about, so that we can measure how many paramedics are able to get back out on the road in less than 45 minutes. That's what we've got to be targeting. How long is the wait time from once you arrive in an emergency room until you get treatment or until you get admitted? And how many surgeries do we have? We were at 69,000 surgeries backlogged when I first began. So I know some of the benchmarks. And as we, in the next couple of weeks, I'm just going to be getting a briefing from Minister Copping later today. But in the next couple of weeks, we'll make those measures available so everybody knows the numbers that we're looking at, and then just be making incremental approaches or incremental progress as we go along. The other part is that I've asked my Technology and Innovation Minister, Nate Glubish, to work on creating the architecture for a health spending account, which would bring more dollars into the system, more money into the hands of individual patients so that they can pay for all the things that are currently not covered by the healthcare system. So that's another major structural change that we're looking at making. And again, it doesn't rely on the federal government for us to do those kinds of things. We have now that we've seen an upsurge in our economy, we've seen a restoration of oil and natural gas prices. We now have our oil sands companies paying a higher rate that gives us a permanently higher level of income. So it does allow for us to have a little more flexibility than we've had in the last 8 years.
All right, let's hit.
If the federal